We'll do just a couple of things to start on Mark, and then we'll work on an outline. And I'd like for us actually to read the majority of chapter 14 and chapter 15 of Mark in a second, not to start with. But a couple of things I want to begin with. Each of the gospel writers is written to, I think they're written to a different audience. And one of the things that stands out in Mark, let's do and compare Matthew to Mark. Most people think Mark was written to more of a Roman mind. There's some indications that Mark may have ended up in Rome, either through travels with Paul. And you remember the very last letter of Paul, he is imprisoned in Rome, and he writes to Timothy, and he says, the winter's coming, and you go get John Mark, bring him to me because he's useful to me in ministry. Earlier, in the earlier imprisonment, this is in Colossians 4, we find that Luke, at the end of Colossians 4, middle really, Luke and Mark and Paul are together while Paul is in prison. So let me reframe that. The end of Acts 28, Paul makes the journey. He's under house arrest for 2 years. And during that time, he's going to write Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And when he writes Colossians, then from that, we know that, and it could have been longer than, but we know he's there a minimum of 2 years. Okay, I don't want to be sarcastic, but just this is what comes to mind. If you have Paul and Mark and Luke together, I doubt they're talking about the chariot races at Rome. And here's something else for you to do on your own time. Sometime just read through Paul's letters and see how many specific events or incidences that you can find in Paul's letters before the cross. Even though he was rich, for our sakes he became poor. That there's a handful of them, but Paul very seldom talks about the events in the life of Jesus before the cross, and virtually all of his writings in terms of the details are the things that happened after that. And as we've kept mentioning, 90% of Mark is where we're going to be tonight. 90% of Mark is in Matthew. And see, that's really important. And in fact, the parts of Mark that are in Matthew are kind of abbreviated because we're going to have the parables and the sermons and the other stuff. So 90% of Mark is in Matthew. 50% of Mark is in Luke. So there has to be some type of sharing, some type of blending. And we find, well, let me say it this way. The majority of the pages of the New Testament are written by these three guys. By the time you do Luke, Acts, 13 letters, and Mark, the majority of the New Testament is there, can I say, in person with Paul while he's in prison? Everybody understand what I'm trying to say? This is not in the Bible, it's just my term. I refer to that as the Gospel Writer Seminar. That's my name. It's not in the Bible. But you read through that part, and very specifically, Luke, the beloved physician, and John Mark is here. And then you kind of step away from that, and then you get to thinking, okay, we know of at least 2 years, and during that 2 years, 3 of the major writers of the New Testament have face-to-face contact. Can I use the word synergy and do this? Can you just imagine the details and what's going on? Now, David is in the Praetorian Guard, 1st century. Think SEALs and Rangers. When you hear Praetorian Guard, think SEALs and Rangers. And these are kind of the elite, we defend Caesar forces, or if we need to go, when I say put out a fire, if we need to go urgently to someplace. But there are times we're in the city of Rome. Well, if you've got the Rangers and the SEALs in Rome, they at least need to be doing something constructive while they're there. It appears that some of these guys may have been on duty, maybe even chained to Paul. And can you imagine going home and telling your family after the first tour of duty? I was with this idiot today, and he kept talking about somebody was raised from the dead, and I just heard the most bizarre things you can imagine. But you can't go to sleep, and you can't walk away. And guess what's going to happen in 2 or 3 weeks if you're chained to Paul for 8 to 10 hours a day? You see what's beginning to happen? And so when you read in Philippians, those in the Praetorian Guard send their greetings. It seems to be like Paul converted some of the guys who, he's the one in chains, but then they have to have guards and stuff there. And so, and I'm not trying to be silly, but if you're on military duty, you've got to be alert, you've got to be awake, you can't just walk off. Sorry, can I use the term captive audience? And these elite military guys that Paul would never have access to going around the empire during that 2 years, how many of them become Christians because they're on duty chained to Paul and they get to listen? And remember the book of Acts? He's talking with people, coming and going, teaching them. The Jews are coming, all this other stuff. Well, that's going on. And then in the meantime, Paul is writing Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Then the other group that are there, from Philippians, you'll see the term Caesar's household. And Caesar's household is the first civil service. And a number of them might be slaves. But if you're in Caesar's household, and even if you're a slave, if Caesar is your boss, you have a lot of influence. And she was godly. One of our wonderful, wonderful ladies at Eastside was the secretary to generals at Tinker Field. What happens if the secretary of the general calls your office? And I had 2 or 3 people say, Doris ran Tinker Field. Now, what am I talking about? Not just primarily her, but in her position. If you're the secretary, and I don't know how many stars they were or anything else, but that doesn't make any difference. If your boss is one of the generals at Tinker Field, and he says, we're going to do A, B, or C, and you get on the phone and do that, things are going to start happening right away. Well, this is what Caesar's household was. And so when you appeal to Caesar, then you enter this bureaucracy and people, setting up eventually a hearing and a trial and all this other stuff. And guess what you get to do? You get to talk to all these people. And so in the book of Philippians, greetings are going to come from Caesar's household. So I think during that 2 years at the end of Acts, there are people in the bureaucracy of the empire that because he's in prison are going to hear the gospel and going to become Christians. And then there are guys in the Praetorian Guard and I just laugh. It's just, what an amazing audience to have. I mean, these guys are sharp as a tack. But if you're out in the empire somewhere, he could never talk to you in Ephesus or talk to you out on the road somewhere. But if you're home and you have his tour of duty there in Rome, and you're also there to protect the emperor, but you have different responsibilities, then a whole group of people are going to hear the gospel and become Christians because of that. So, the very last letter we have in 2 Timothy, Paul says, winter's coming. My dad would say, don't waste a bit of time. And the reason is the shipping lanes close down in the winter. And he'd have to come over land, which would take a long time to get there. But you go get John Mark, bring him with you because he is useful to me in ministry. And when you go back, who's the guy who caused the split between Paul and Barnabas? John Mark, because he had deserted. may I say this kindly? In hindsight, at some point, Paul realized Barnabas was right. And then you think how we as the church and older Christians treat a younger Christian when they stumble may have a lot to do with if they get back on their feet or not. What if John Mark would have just felt, oh, I failed and nobody believes in me, and Barnabas is going to stick with him. He did the same thing for Saul before he becomes Paul. Barnabas does the same thing for this young man. And so here's part of the background of how the events in the life of Mark took place. But we're just going to do two things, and then we'll start on an outline. I'll hand it out. I want you to look in Mark chapter 3, and depending if you have a newer translation, do you have parentheses from verses 3 down through 4 in your translation?
Chapter 3?
No, I'm wrong. I may have misstated. Mark chapter 7. Thank you. I could tell I'd done something wrong. Mark chapter 7. I have parentheses in mind from verses 3 down through 4. Okay? Now, we don't have footnotes on papyrus scrolls. And this was probably just a part of the running text. But why do you think translators 2,000 years later are going to put something in parentheses that's in the text of the Bible? It's going to be like a footnote in that, oh, here is kind of a historical reference, and let me give you some background of what this means. So, when you read the early parts, Pharisees, teachers of the law, some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands, that is ceremonially unwashed hands. And let me just pause. Every Pharisee and every Jew who read the book of Matthew would know what that meant. Everybody follow what I'm trying to say? You wouldn't have to explain washing hands if you're writing to a Jewish audience. That'd be like explaining to an Okie what the Dust Bowl was. You know, if you have roots in Oklahoma, you just... Now, some from California might look at you and say, well, do you need a rag or something? But when we hear the term Dust Bowl, because of the culture here, we know exactly here what that means. Well, whoever is reading Mark doesn't know the Jewish tradition about washing hands. And so he says, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they, and do you see what I'm saying in terms of audience? Whoever's reading this is not a native Jewish person. This is probably not even a person who's been in the synagogue. They give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other customs or traditions, such as washing cups, pitchers, and kettles. You see what I'm saying? This gives you a real glimpse into whoever the readers are, and this is totally different from, oh, this is the beginning of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You don't do that kind of thing in Mark either, where a Jew would look at that and think, oh, that's home. That's my people. And whoever is reading Mark will refer to the Jewish people as they. Richard?
Off subject just a little
That's
bit.
fine.
Chapter 7, verse 3. The New American Standard, where it says they carefully wash their hands, has a footnote that says, with the fist. You got any background on that?
No.
Okay.
All I know is that there were pitchers, pots, and kettles, and let me do it this way, fairly quickly, but still, hopefully we'll tie it together. Here's Malachi, and about halfway between Malachi and the birth of Jesus. Okay, we're going to have a lot of changes that take place, and in the 160s down to the 70s, both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and let's just say Republicans and Democrats, they were political parties. They were trying to rule, and there's a period of time the Sadducees rule, and they kill Pharisees, and then when the Pharisees take control, they kill Sadducees, which is how intense it was. Somewhere, as you get within the century before Jesus, the Pharisees decided, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to let them because of money and other stuff. And we are going to become a piety, a cleanliness movement. We're going to try to, there's so much, and I'm using the word filth in terms of moral purity and other stuff. Romans, Greeks, there's so much filth. We want to raise the standard for the average Jew to that of the priest in the Old Testament because we have so much filth around us. And so therefore, we're going to be very scrupulous about washing hands, washing pots, washing kettles. And our standard is not just the Old Testament. We're going to raise the standard virtually to the level of the priesthood to be a piety, purity movement. 90% of the Jews said, we don't want to be bothered with that. And the highest percentage that I've been able to read, and these are guesstimates, but still, the highest percentage is about 10%. But here's 10%, and remember, you cross land and sea to make a proselyte and make him twice the son of hell that you are. They and the disciples of Jesus are trying to evangelize the same group of people. And here's part of the intensity. And we did this in another class with just a couple of lines. His name is Yohanan ben Zakkai, the rabbi, and they're in Jerusalem, and they can begin to tell this is not going to end well. And they build a coffin and put him in the coffin, put the lid on it, and Yohanan's Jewish disciples take Yohanan to the gate before it's a lockdown, and they say, oh, our master has died. May we please take him out across the hill and bury him. And before the city is locked down, they get the leader of Judaism outside of the city of Jerusalem, and they watch the destruction of Jerusalem from the hillside. When the temple goes up in flames and the city's burning, one of the disciples says to Yohanan, Master, what will we do? And just like that, he says, and here's a quotation, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And Judaism, within the shadows of the destruction of Jerusalem, moves from a sacrificial system to an ethical, moral system, which then complemented the washing of hands and kettles that they had been doing all along. But, and I say this kindly because none of us second-guess God, but you talk about a transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. Of all things, Elmer Hall was the first person I heard someone say this. He said, did you know there's not a Jew alive that can tell you what tribe they're from? I'd never thought about that. He said, all the records are destroyed. He said, so, and what's the animal rights? PETA, whatever. Can you imagine the fit that PETA would be in if we lined up and slaughtered 15 lambs on Passover? And he said, in the transition from the old to the new, then the building, temple, the building is destroyed in August of 70. All of the records genealogical records are destroyed. And he said, people can say, and they're Jews, but he said, there's not a Jew alive today that can tell you what tribe they're from. How can we have the sacrificial system without people from the tribe of Levi? And a part of that transition took place, but this washing of pots, washing of kettles and stuff that we're going to see here in Mark 7. And like I said, footnote, explanation. Let me look in Mark chapter 7, verse 19. Whoops, let me go back a little bit. Go back to verse 11. See, here's the word Corban. And again, if you have the parentheses, what does he say? Oh, that is a gift devoted to God. And then when you go down to verse 19, it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. So all I want you to notice is that whoever is reading Mark is not a native Jewish person. I doubt they're even a person probably who's been in the synagogue who are the God-fearers that Luke describes. And then one other thing, and then we're going to jump into an outline. Turn to chapter 15, and we just touched on this last week. Richard, go ahead and flip over to Romans 16:13 for me as well. And what we're going to do tonight is just try to imagine if we are this Greek, if we're this audience, we're the first readers of Mark. And at this point, we don't have Matthew, we don't have Luke, we don't have John. And something very interesting, and again, a little bit trivial, but I think very significant. A certain man from Cyrene. Where's Cyrene? I think it's going to be North Africa. A certain man from Cyrene. And all of the other accounts say Simon. And what does Mark tell us? Why would you include that the others don't include, if the readers of this book don't know who Alexander and Rufus are? Everybody follow what I'm saying? And I mentioned this before. I'm in Memphis, I'm in downtown, driving back. There's somebody on every corner, and I'm thinking this is a newspaper guy. And the first one, I'm driving and all this stuff, and driving to Memphis, you've got your life in your hands. The king is dead. And I'm thinking, I thought we fought a civil war to do that. And then a street or two later, oh, Elvis is dead. Well, he had died that afternoon, and every newspaper had these huge headlines and guys on virtually every... Why didn't I hear the word Presley? In Memphis, Tennessee, all you have to say is Elvis, and everybody knows who that is. And in this case, whoever is reading Mark knows Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. We do not know this for 100%, but Richard, read Romans 16:13.
Read Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine.
Okay. We don't know 100% it's the same person, but we do have a reference. Where's it at? City of Rome. Wonderful lesson, and I don't know if and when I'll do it here, but I borrowed it from someone else. Romans 16 has nearly a third of the names that we know in the New Testament. And a preacher from a different group gave a lesson called When the Roll is Called Down Here. And we all know when the roll is called up yonder. And here's this whole list of people. And in that list, and it may be a totally different person, but that's something that's just very interesting when you read this. Now, I want us to look in Mark 15, and we're just going to do a quick reading of some sections, and then we're going to just kind of walk through some things. And what we want to do, and I used the term earlier, just kind of put on blinkers, and don't assume, don't read into the other accounts. And the other thing too, let me just mention it again. Our New Testament was written for the ear before it was written for the eye. There's going to be large percentages of people in churches that may be illiterate and can't read. And that's why you're going to hear terms like in Timothy, give heed to the public reading of Scripture. We had a wonderful, wonderful godly couple. They always sat on the second row right in front of us. Brother Weaver couldn't read. And as little guys, we were always told, speak up when you read, because if you can't put your Bible in your lap at home, he never missed a service. He was always there because that was his chance to hear the Word of God. And so this would probably have been read in churches initially, because even if you can copy it, how long is it going to take to make a copy? So the first people are going to hear the Gospel of Mark before they're going to be able to read it. Mark 15, very early in the morning. And remember, before electricity, most people go to bed at dark. And, unless you're just exhausted, if you've been in bed for 12 hours, you can't wait for the sun to come up. I'll just tell this real quick. One of my dad's neighbors, when my dad died, came to me and he said, 3 times at 3:30 in the morning when that tractor fired up, I was just sure somebody was stealing my equipment. So he said I had my boots and my pants and my gun. And I went outside to try to defend someone stealing my tractor. And he said, the wind was out of your north. And he said, your dad had woke up and decided, it's damp enough, the soil, I can see the soil without having to turn the lights on. So he fired up his tractor and started plowing the wheat field at 3:30 in the morning. And you plow until 6:30 or something, and then you drive 70 to 80 mile an hour into town and get a cup of coffee because you have to leave the coffee shop before 7 or they'll accuse you of sleeping in. And then he'd go back and plow some more. But he said after the third time, when I heard that tractor fire up at 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning, I thought, oh, that's just Marshall. Everything's okay, Well, if you live in the ancient world and we don't have electricity, boy, things start cracking as soon as the sun comes up. And this is important too, because if you're a pilot, it doesn't matter what kind of night's rest you had, you're going to have to make some really critical decisions while you still have sleep in your eyes. And here come these aggravating Jews beating on your door very early in the morning. The chief priest with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound him to Jesus, led him away, handed him over to Pilate. Can you just imagine what's the word you'd use for Pilate? If you're Pilate, how do you feel at the crack of dawn, this whole crowd of people showing up? How do you feel? Someone help me. Pardon?
Bewildered?
A bit bewildered, frustrated. Oh, it's those ornery Jews again. Nathan, can you imagine telling your wife, sweetheart, we're going to get a new posting and we're actually going to be able to live in Caesarstown and overlook the Mediterranean. And she says, and where is that? And he says, well, it's in Palestine. And she says, oh, the armpit of the Roman Empire? We're going to have to go live with those picky. Well, we're going to live in Caesarstown. Sweetheart, we're going to live in Caesarea. You're going to be able to see the Mediterranean and on and on. And she says, and you're going to be dealing with Jews while we're there. Well, honey, there's a really pretty view of the ocean. And you can just see how that conversation would take place. Because of all the places you'd like to be posted, this is on the bottom of the list. And as I said earlier, this is number 3 of 6 confrontations that Pilate has with the Jews. And he's there for about a decade, and finally they do get him deposed. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And look at what Mark has left out. But that's the charge. Yes, it is as you say. The chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked, are you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you, but Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. We had a reading of Isaiah 53 on Sunday. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and yet he opened not his mouth. Anticipate this, Lord willing, when we get to John. Jesus is in charge of the trial and only says enough for Pilate to convict him. But he doesn't help him. And at this point, there's no reply. It was the custom of the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. And let me go ahead and anticipate this for you. If you put a dash after bar, what do you have? Barabbas, you got Barabbas, but put a dash after bar, what do you have? Bar Abba. His name means the son of the Father. Remember King James, who art thou? Oh, you are Simon Bar Jonah, son of Jonah. Remember that? And so this gets knee deep in irony before we get through. The prisoner who they're going to set free, his name, Barabbas, means the son of the Father, and we're going to let him go, and then we're going to crucify the Son of God. And just let that sink in. Barabbas, do the hyphen, When you read that in the future, just do that happen, Bar, son of Abba. So it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison. And why is he there? Insurrection, and had committed murder in the uprising. Now, just start contrasting, again, John's talking about the innocent Lamb of God, and look at who we're going to let go, and look at who we're going to crucify. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Knowing it was out of envy that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate to release Barabbas. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he done? And they shouted all the louder, Crucify him. And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, we're going to stay primarily with Mark, but let me just mention this one thing. If you're Barabbas and you're within earshot of what's going on, what do you hear the crowd shouting first? Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And this part isn't in Mark. But later, you're in prison, and you're hearing, crucify, and then you start hearing, give us Barabbas. So if you're in prison, and you hear people shouting, crucify him, and then give us Barabbas, Brad, what do you assume is going on?
I'm thinking my time's short.
It's all over. Because here you're hearing this. Again, you see what I'm saying? Put yourself in prison, and if you can hear the noise, and they're making the plan, they're putting all the pressure on Pilate they can. And so the initial cry is, crucify him, crucify, at the top of their voice. And then the other count's going to say, give us Barabbas. And so if you're this poor guy in prison, and the guy comes with the key, what do you assume is about to happen? It's all over. And what happens? You're set free. Isn't that a wonderful image for what spiritually is going to happen to and for us at the cross? Yes, sir.
You think, I haven't really thought about this before, but Pilate being in the pickle that he was in,
Yeah.
okay, he figured if he put somebody up,
Yeah.
like Barabbas,
Yeah.
because this person was an insurrectionist, a murderer,
Mhm.
okay, somebody that would be against Caesar,
Mm-hmm.
that they would think twice about asking for it.
Yeah.
I mean that's what comes to mind.
Well, and because, and again, this is a well-known figure. Can we use the word ringleader probably and been involved in this? I'm putting words in Pilate's mouth because we're going to see different accounts of the interaction and what took place. But I think at the end of the day, Pilate finally figured, if I have to answer to Caesar for a riot that took place in Jerusalem, I would fare better if I just crucified the occasional Jew rather than to have a complete riot. And something else to consider, Julius Caesar had two sons that both either were killed or died, and so he adopted, which is a really big biblical word. You don't adopt babies in the ancient world. In fact, before Christians, this is gross, so get ready, there was kind of an area where you just left and abandoned unwanted babies and small children. Okay, this is gross. If you want slaves, if you want prostitutes, if you want body parts, babies were readily available. You only adopt, kind of like the NFL draft. You adopt 18, 20-year-olds, especially if you just have girls and you don't have any guys. And so adoption, no one adopted babies. We're 2,000 years away from that. And so the whole idea of killing a few Jews to keep the peace is going to be something that would be easier to explain to Caesar. But When Tiberius became emperor, he's 55. And he really wasn't happy about getting the job. And as he got older, he got more and more unstable. And the last 10 years of Tiberius' reign, he actually goes to the island of Capri and is in absentia. We're in John, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Everybody knows Caesar's already unstable. Can I use the word cranky? And everybody, okay, sorry, I don't want to use it, but he is. He didn't want this in the first place, and as he gets older, he likes it less and less. Unpredictable, maybe even a little bit unstable, and that's the state of the emperor, and so they're going to use every leverage that they can, but at this point, Pilate is thinking, aha, surely they won't ask for an enemy of Rome and an insurrectionist, and this kind of reveals a whole lot to Pilate. Okay, this is more than I dealt for, and I may still have the sleep in my eyes. These guys have been up all night long. My dad would say they're hot to trot. They're doing everything they can to get this done. But then here's the other thing, and think about this. We'll see an account as well that they do not go into the Roman palace because they do not want to become unclean, defiled. This is our chance, and we've got to get it done before the sun goes down. Can you see the impetus and the push that's going on? And they've been plotting this for a long time, and here's finally our chance, and we've got to get all this done. And that's why I'm saying they're beating on the door just as, you know, the chickens have just got through crowing and the sun's coming up. And poor Pilate, you're not at your best probably just at that hour, and he's confronted with all of this stuff that's going on and all the noise. And so they've been shouting, "Crucify him." What crime has he done? We're in 15:14. Crucify him, wanting to satisfy the crowd. Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, anticipate, who is the Gospel of Luke written to? Most excellent Theophilus. And we have a most excellent Festus, a most excellent Felix in the book of Acts. And what does most excellent do? They hear trials and things. Luke, when we come to this, are going to give 3 charges, which the officers look, you know, if you're writing to an attorney, if you're writing to a legal mind, he's going to give 3 charges, and then he's going to give 3 attempts that Pilate makes to let him go, and Mark is going to compress that. So here we are, 15:16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole company of soldiers. And the whole idea is just to humiliate and embarrass him. They put a purple robe on him, and purple, remember Lydia, seller of purple cloth? Purple, there were these snails, and I don't know exactly where they collected them, but I know they were snails. And as you let's use the word process them. I'm trying to think of a good word. As you process them, you might get a little bitty drop out of each snail of purple dye. So if you're gonna purple dye a whole garment, how many snails have you had to process if you're only going to get just a little bit out of each one? And hence, that's why, can I use the term, she's a high market clothes salesman. And so in mockery, then they're going to get this very purple robes. Let me do one other thing real quick. The Roman Empire, especially through the first century, culturally is a triangle. At the very top, obviously, Caesar. And then underneath that are the senators, and I think there's 100. Under them are either the decurions or the knights, and then the free people, and then the base, which in some places would be 30, 50, 60%, is the slaves. But the 100 senators at the top were the really elite people, and they oftentimes wore purple robes and a white sash. And wherever they went, people would know, Roman senator. And so while this isn't a senatorial robe, but you can kind of see what I'm saying in terms of the separateness and the set apart, and a part of the mockery. They put a purple robe on him. Can I use the word creative? These guys are really gonna get with it here. They weave together a crown of thorns. Would you be able to weave together a crown of thorns and not get any blood pricks on you?
Yeah.
And I read this and oftentimes think, well, at least if I was doing it, there'd be a little bit of... I doubt that you could weave together these long thorns that are in this thing without at least getting a little prick on you. And they set it on him. They begin to call out, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff. They spit on him. And here's something very interesting, the last part of 19. The word for worship, well, there's two or three, but the most common word for worship is proskuneo, and it literally means to bow the knee. So the root word for, let's say it this way, the most common word for worship in its literal sense is the bending of the knee. And so, falling on their knees, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe, put on his own clothes, and they led him out to crucify him. Someone help me. The day will come where every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess what? Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. May I say it this way? It's going to be too late for some people in terms of to be redeemed. But one of the final statements, the day will come where every knee will bow, every tongue will confess Jesus Christ is Lord. And in mockery, then these guys are literally falling on their knees, which is that's kind of the irony of the word. And when they fall down to worship him, that's the essence of what the word actually means in its original sense. So here's our friend Simon. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing on his way in from the country. Okay. Wouldn't you love to talk with him later? Well, I was just coming into town, minding my own business, and what's going to happen? They forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, and again you have a parenthesis for your non-Jewish readers, which means the place of the skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him, and dividing his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. And I always have a note of Psalm 22:18 that has this idea of the casting of lots that's given in a prophecy by David. Now, we did this earlier, but just for review, when you hear the term third hour, think of a sundial, okay? And as a couple of guys said, they don't have Rolex or Timex watches on. So think of 0 at sunrise. When you hear the third hour, think 9 o'clock, right? When you hear the 6th hour, think noon. And then when you hear the 9th hour, think 3 o'clock. And then the 12th hour is going to be dark. So regardless of how many hours were actually in the day, doing it visually, then do this sundial in your hand, and that helps you to see that depending upon your translation. So Mark tells us they have him on the cross by 9 o'clock. And that's why when you read this, every time I read this is what I hear. I don't always make the noise, but, they came to Pilate very early in the morning, and I hear this knocking sound in my head, and I'm thinking, okay, the roosters have probably been crowing since 4 o'clock, but as soon as those they don't dare wake him up in the dark, because they're going to try to pressure him anyway, so they're at least going to wait till the first rays of sunlight. But I promise you, the sun is just cracking over the horizon, and here is this whole mob of people at the door, shouting and hollering and all this other stuff, that puts him in a really difficult bind. Now, it's the third hour when they crucified him. The notice written of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those passing by hurled insults, shaking their heads and saying, "So," does anyone have the word aha there? Okay, we're going to come back to that. That's a really important word. This translation just says so, but when I read that, I know this is, can I say it this way? Aha. This is one of these terms of derision and ridicule. You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. And every time I read this, I shake my head. The apostles never did understand what that meant. Right hand, left hand, rule in Jerusalem, who's going to be the greatest, and who understood or remembered that he said, oh, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll build it again. And it's going to be the religious leaders are the ones who remembered that. The chief priests, teachers of the law, mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. And those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Now we're going to come back and look at this in a list. Everybody involved in the whole event, including the 2 poor guys who are crucified, are going to ridicule and make fun of him. I don't know that any of us have the capacity to know how lonely a feeling this is. Everybody has left you. Okay, this is trivial in comparison, but I think of this. My freshman year, I walked on basketball at OC for 4 years, which meant I wasn't either good enough or quick enough to get a scholarship. But if you'll give me a pair of shoes, I'll give you my body for a year and we'll call it an even trade. And so my freshman year, I also went out for track after basketball was over. And these guys have been running since August. And here you are in late February or March. And we go to Winfield, Kansas, and Coach Vaughn says, well, son, just like you run the mile today and, get some training condition. I think, okay. He said, don't get discouraged, but run the mile. So on the way, these 2 guys said, you see that place there? This has the best fried chicken of any place on the whole tour, and we always stop there. We're going to eat fried chicken on the way home, so pass that away. So ran the mile and, probably was last and did the best I could. And I should have either hidden or gone to the bus, but I didn't. And I'm walking around and I feel this hand on my shoulder, and Coach Vaughn says, son, there's just one more event we'd like for you to do today. And I said, yes, sir. He said, don't worry. It's only 3 miles. And my first thought is, I'll be so sick I won't even be able to eat chicken tonight by the time this is over. He said, I know you've already run a mile, but that way you kind of got warmed up, so you need to kind of stretch a little bit and just don't get discouraged, but just do this for conditioning. Okay, the sun's kind of starting to go down when this starts. How many laps is 3 miles? 12. By the second lap, it's evident I'm going to get lapped at least once by the Greyhounds. And there was about 10 college students on the 220 who had, until I came around the next time, to think of something smart to say. Hey, buddy, if you'll cut across the field, we won't tell anybody. Then you come by again, and a guy has a hat, and he says, we've been taking up money because we're going to turn the lights on before you get through. Hey, buddy, we're taking odds on how many times you're going to get lapped before the race is over. You get 10 or 12 smart, intelligent college students, and they have until you come around the whole time to say something really smart. What do I say? Frustrating, humiliating, all this other stuff. Gary Hill, who actually beat Bruce Jenner twice in the decathlon was trying to set the pole vault record at the track meet, and he heard the peanut gallery, and he would wait and jump in between runs, and he would say something, or even sometimes pat me on the back and say, hang in there and do that. But they've got 10 laps to think of as something really, really smart to say before you come back around. Richard, you don't dare say anything to them. You just grit your teeth and try to keep going and try to get this done. And I don't know if I'll be able to eat a thing tonight by the time this is all over with. Trivial. But when you're out there and you're exposed and you're all by yourself and everybody's thinking of something smart to say, there's really no way to defend yourself.
This wasn't your teammates, was it?
Do what?
This wasn't your teammates.
No, these were kids in Kansas. And the next track meet or two, we'd Oklahoma Christian, and I tried to stay away from Coach Vaughn as much as I could after that. And he came up to me and he said, son, he said, I just want you to do one event today. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, it's just one event. I said, what? He says, well, it's just the steeplechase. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, there's 4 or 5 hurdles, and these are square things, and there's a water pit. And this one's only 2 miles. And so, Brad, you run about 110 yards, and these hurdles don't fall down. They will do you bodily harm. But after the first trip, your feet are wet. And you've got 7 more trips to go, and you're trying to jump over wooden hurdles with wet feet. And I'm thinking I'm going to do a backstroke, a side stroke, because there's a water pit. And the longer you run, the less further out you can get. And he said, son, there's only 4 people in the event. There's 5 places, and your 1 point might make sure we win the track meet, so I need you to run the steeplechase for insurance today. The OC crowd was totally different than the Kansas crowd. I still came in last. But the difference in having people supporting you and cheering you is really important. And let me just say it this way. We had a dear friend, and he said we should always treat people like their hearts are breaking. And every Sunday, someone has come to church, and they're wondering if I'm going to be able to come back again. Or every Sunday, someone's come to church, and there's been a doctor's report. Every Sunday, someone's come to church, and you fill in the blank. And this is something I just, at different times, have cried over. It's just the absolute sense of loneliness hanging on the cross, and then everybody there, well, you know, there's a few women and there's John, but outside of that little bitty huddle, everybody there is taking shots at you and saying something either in derision or in ridicule. So that was the 3rd hour. I'm in 33, the 6th hour, so everybody calculate. We've gone from 9 till noon. Darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. So can I say it this way? We have 3 hours of sunlight on the cross, and then we have 3 hours of darkness on the cross. Everybody just follow what happened? So if he's there from the 3rd hour to the 9th hour, our Lord's on the cross 6 hours. But just when I look at it, I think the first 3 hours, the sun's still shining. And then from noon until he dies at 3 o'clock, then there's darkness over the face of the earth. I wonder how much ridicule and laughter was going on in the darkness. I mean, you just, you know, do we try to find for darkness to come at noon. Sorry?
They probably weren't ready for it.
No, nobody's ready for it. And we're outside the city and on and on. And the tone of things are going to totally change. We're going to have 2 totally different atmospheres. Kind of a carnival, ridicule, ha ha ha, all this stuff. And then, man, you have this 3 hours of darkness, and everything's going to change very, very quickly. My grandfather lived out in Sayre, halfway to Amarillo, and he told me, son, he said, once when the Dust Bowl was at its heart, Model A's and Model T's had a ornament on the front of the hood. And he said at noon, I was coming back from the city, and he just called it the cloud. He said the cloud rolled in, and it was so dark I couldn't see the ornament on the front of my hood at noon. And he said the only thing to do is try to pull off the road and not get in a deep ditch and hope that nobody coming along in the darkness runs into you, because he said if you can't see the ornament on the front of your hood, you can't drive. And he said that's one of the most strange natural phenomena that I've ever been in. And while he's talking about that, I'm just thinking, and what was it like? And we don't know how dark it was, but still, the contrast is what we want to see. 9 to noon, ha ha ha, laughter, ridicule, and everything else. And then I think the shift is going to take place, and the last 3 hours are going to be very, very different in tone, because nobody expected this to happen at noon for that to take place.
Well, I think about fog. Fog is the same way.
Yeah.
You can't see this far in front of you. What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. I was 8th or 9th grade. Sarah was playing Carnegie. We had a really good team, a lot of passing, other stuff. Halfway through the first quarter, a fog came in from the river, a dry river, but still it came across the river. And they had to move the chains over to the other side of the field. And when they punted, the announcer asked for silence, and they sent 3 guys back to listen for where the ball hit the ground, because you couldn't see it. So the announcer would say, would everyone please be quiet until the punt is over? And so you're going to punt this thing up into the fog, and you send 3 guys back. In this case, 3 guys with good hearing, because you got to wait till it hits the ground. Hey, it's over here, it's over here. And then if you're the defense and you've got to trigger figure out which one of these guys in the fog has the ball, and they were big and strong, and we had finesse, and we got killed because you can't pass and do all your stuff if you can't pass and see the ball. It just changed the whole thing. But I'm thinking of the emotion. Look at how the emotion is then going to shift and totally change during that last part. At the 9th hour, so we've been on the cross 6 hours, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And again, for our non-Hebrew readers, everybody follow where we started this in Mark chapter 7? My God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those near heard, and they said, he's calling Elijah. A man ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, offered it to Jesus to drink. Leave him alone and see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who had stood in front of Jesus heard the cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Do you have anything different? Is that what you have most in your translations? Truly, surely, this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, the younger of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed Jesus and cared for his needs, and many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So we're going to start on a page, and then we'll take a break and stretch a little bit and then finish it up. But let's see if we can get this one out. On Wednesday night, I'm doing a class this month in Edmond on fingerprints of faith in the next generation. And one of my philosophies with our children and grandchildren is that as much as possible, we need to under-promise and over-perform. You don't want to promise kids something and then just not be able to do it at all. And so of the two options, if possible, we want to under-promise and over-perform. And I wouldn't say this publicly because people look at you like, who do you think you are? But what I want to try to do tonight and our next 3 Wednesday nights is to influence and impact the way you read the crucifixion in the gospel accounts for the rest of your life. And I can hear somebody on Sunday morning thinking, okay, and who do you think you are? Well, it's not that. But as we said last week, every one of the writers has something unique to say about the cross. And if we read the gospel accounts, and I know there's times for us to go sideways and look at the others, but what I want to encourage you to do within the next couple of days, sit down on your own and just kind of reread this and then be thinking, if I'm in that first audience and I didn't grow up in Palestine, I wasn't an eyewitness, I didn't see what happened, how would Mark's account of the cross resonate with you as a non-Jew not living in Jerusalem? Everybody kind of see that? And then, Lord willing, read next week, a little bit later, Matthew. And Matthew's going to he's going to tell the same event, but when you start with the genealogy of David and Abraham, you're going to tell the story from the Jewish perspective, and you're not going to have the parentheses and the footnotes to the same degree that Mark has, because these people culturally are closer to the events than the readers of Mark are going to be. So the term, and this is also going to be said in Matthew, but we'll explain this more next week. The term I want you kind of to anchor is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And when I read the crucifixion in Mark, that's what rings in my ear. This is a matter of emphasis, and there's room for discussion. I've listened to people say, well, Jesus is going to say the Father and I are one and all this other stuff. And they minimize this. Well, I'll just say it the other way. I feel like, and think about this, and we can talk about this in the days to come. I feel like whatever that meant when the passage says, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. To some degree or another, I think the sense, both of the sense of the Father turning his face from him is the picture kind of in my mind. Our 3 hours of darkness is, in this sense, God is going to place at least the burden of our sins on him. And when you read Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, Isaiah says, your iniquities have separated you from God. And to some degree or another, God places, and what terms are appropriate, the guilt, the burden, whatever you want to say, of our sin upon him. And in that time, our Lord feels forsaken. And does God withdraw either his presence, his care from him while he's suffering? Something for us to just kind of talk about. But when I hear, why have you forsaken me? That's what comes to mind. Now, anticipate, Lord willing, and we'll do next week, and then we'll have a break for Halloween. But we'll do Matthew next week, and he will say the same thing from the cross, but watch what's going to happen. Matthew's going to give all the plotting and planning and scheming that the Jews did, that Mark just tells us they knocked on the door, and all this stuff that took place. So we're going to see the background of what all took place on the Jewish side. Oh, well, this was done to fulfill. Oh, this was done to fulfill. And so when I read Matthew, it's going to be forsaken, but Matthew's going to fill in, and I do this in my mind, on both sides of the cross. Here's what they did, the plotting and the planning and the scheming, and here's what God did. We're going to learn more about Judas in Matthew than any of the other accounts. Scheming, plotting, planning on this side. And our bottom line next week will be, the cross was not an accident. They've been planning and plotting and planning, and no one's going to carry a cross today by accident either. That'll be next week. But the expression, my God, why have you forsaken me? So when you look, why did Jesus die on the cross? If a ransom is laid on him, Exodus 21:30, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is laid on him. And there's a whole list of consequences of things that will happen, and it continued in Leviticus, animals killed, and this is what takes place. But we're introduced to this word ransom, which is going to be very important in our text here. And here it comes in Mark 10:44. And this is the third time he predicts his death in Mark. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. And to my mind, this is the most significant theological, doctrinal statement about the cross in the book of Mark. For the Son of Man also did not come to be served, but to serve, and then here it comes, to give his life a ransom for many. Now, we are never told who the ransom is paid to or for, but the term ransom is used. And as we're going to see, ransom is if you have prisoners, if you have family members. I wouldn't do this with your grandkids. If I say Patty Hearst. Richard, what happened?
Fell in with the wrong crowd. There had to be a ransom at some point.
Pictures in a bank robbery and all stuff, but the whole object of the whole thing was the ransom that was there. To some of our grandparents, we could use the term Charles Lindbergh. And their child's kidnapped and killed, eventually, on and on. So we know a little bit about the term ransom in that context. In their context, prisoners of war, slaves, family members. So a price is paid to release them from some type of captivity, danger, or something else, and then to restore them and to bring them back. And so Mark has this really significant loaded term to give his life as a ransom for many. So who's Jesus? Mark begins, and the very beginning of the gospel, this is the beginning of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And anticipate this as we go through. I think Son of God is a really significant term, and let me go ahead and anticipate. What does the centurion say on the cross? Surely this was Son of God. So literally the opening verse, and of all things, Peter doesn't say, Peter in Mark just says, you're the Christ. Matthew's going to add the Son of God. The first person to say he is the Son of God is a Roman, he's a centurion, and he's a non-Jew. That to me is really significant. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, one in one. And this whole thing, but in between, the ones who shout, Son of God, are going to be evil spirits. We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. Shh. Every time in Mark an evil spirit sees Jesus, he's shouting at the top of his lungs what Mark started at the first. And what are the Pharisees saying? Who do you think you are? Who gave you this authority? And on a scale, this is terrible, but on a scale of 1 to 10, the evil spirits are 10 and the Pharisees are 1 in terms of accepting and acknowledging who he is. Until the Roman centurion is the first human being in 15 then to say that one there was the Son of God. And I wonder, and this is one of those things we'll find out later, but I wonder if this is a Roman audience, how significant is it that the first human in Mark, it's not going to be true in Matthew, but the first human in Mark to declare fully he's the Son of God is a non-Jewish Roman centurion. I just find that really interesting. You are my son whom I love, with you I'm well pleased, the voice from heaven. And here are the evil spirits, and they do this over and over again. But in Mark, as early as chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, the opposition starts, and by the time you get to chapter 3, we're planning to kill him. He doesn't use the word cross. He doesn't use the word crucify. We looked at that last week. We're a year within the cross when he starts talking about that for the first time. But the idea of killing him and plotting and planning, Mark is going to start already in chapter 2. And the religious leaders have decided he's blaspheming. Only God forgives sins. So Jesus will start talking about his death, both in terms of parables and in teachings. But Matthew will give us more details, but look at the plotting and the planning. 3:6, 11:18, 12:12, 14:1. Pharisees and Herodians, they took counsel how to destroy him, to entrap him. And Mark has this kind of like this boiling controversy going from the very beginning. And while, again, the word crucify is not used until a year within the cross, the scheming and the plotting and the planning is already underway. So in the shortest gospel, this is number 6, Jesus repeatedly, prophetically announces his rejection and death. And we did this last week, but it's at 8:30. It's actually mentioned in 9:12, but 9:31 and 10:31. And parable teaching about the killing of the beloved son. And so here's a short quotation. Mark demonstrates that at the moment of Jesus' death is a moment of divine revelation. Only in his death can Jesus be fully appreciated. In this gospel, the significance of the confession of the centurion is that he is the only human to recognize Jesus as God's son. The centurion sees how Jesus dies and then makes his confession. And in Mark, it is on the cross that Jesus is rightly recognized, and I said finally, as the Son of God by someone that he came to ransom from their sins. That to me is kind of this amazing disclosure. And like I said, it'll be different in the other accounts, but you're reading through Mark for the first time. The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. And then here he is hanging on the cross. And the first person to just correctly and rightly say, that one there is the Son of God. What an ironic context and place for Jesus to be confessed as the Son of God. But it still strikes me, he's not a Jew, and he's not an apostle. And that's the first one that's going to make that confession. So God's going to recognize Jesus as his son at the temptation, the transfiguration, and in his death. It is the understanding that's shared by a Gentile soldier. We'll go ahead and start. Like I said, just feel free to kind of relax and enjoy that. I was telling someone last week when we started the new church in Sydney, in Campbelltown, you just start from scratch, but very early we had 21 kids and 11 adults. And at 7 years old, our son Luke was the oldest of 21 kids. So we did not have any quiet moments of meditation around the Lord's Supper. And if one or two of us were gone teaching and they had brought friends, there were times we were nearly outnumbered 3-1. And so anyway, you can't do anything to bother me in terms of eating or anything else. We'll just kind of enjoy and do that, and we'll finish up with this next part of it. I did this thought on a Lord's Supper talk probably even a year ago. But one of the things that really stands out to me when I read Mark is the intensity, and I kind of use the word the enthusiasm, of those who are worshiping him in ridicule. And so when you read this, they are really in it. They are really involved. And you can obviously see where this is going. None of these guys are just spectators. They're doing everything they can to add to the shame and the ridicule. And I was just reading this several years ago, and we'll see this as a conclusion a little bit, and I thought, wouldn't it be a shame if those who worshiped him in ridicule are doing a more effective job in ridicule than we are in spirit and in truth? And that contrast just really stands out to me. I don't feel any guilt about it, okay? And like, for example, I know Charles has said this. We had a guy that would work the night shift at Eastside. Okay, Greg, if you've worked all night and you get to church on Sunday and you get still and quiet, there's going to be sometimes that you're just going to drop off. I mean, and sometimes he'd apologize. I says, look, we know whose side you're on. Don Van Zandt always said, the most spiritual thing a tired Christian can do is sleep. And if you need to sleep, you do the very best you can. I appreciate the fact that you haven't just used this as an excuse and you're just doing the best that you can. Well, we're not always at our best, but one of the things, and this is a part of our Wednesday night discussion, one of the things that we started in our house on Saturday was Sunday's the best day of the week.
Yeah.
And we wanted to start getting that mentality and that attitude ready. We would have something special for breakfast on Sunday that we didn't have the rest of the week. When the kids were little, lay their clothes out. Let's do breakfast. We put a cappella songs on, have some type of songs going on. And we tried to set the tone so that when we came, we were in the mindset and ready to worship. We all have gotten here and just said, I'm just glad I got here. You know, there's times we're just frazzled. One of your cousins, our second born, had this lovely skirt dress thing on, and we just were putting the key in the door, and things were running down her leg and down Sheila's clothes as we're trying to lock the door to go to church. Sheila says, we are getting in the shower. So she reaches down and gets her skirt to try to keep stuff off the floor and off the carpet. She says, we are getting in the shower, and she should have a onesie on. I think there's a pink onesie in the second drawer, and get another diaper. In a little bit, I'm going to hand you out a clean, naked little girl. We're going to leave all the clothes in the shower. I'm going to take a shower. Then I'm going to get dressed, and then we're going to start all over and try this again. Okay, sometimes by the time you get here, it's like, okay, we're here. But from week to week, what have I done to be in a worshipful frame of mind? And as ironic as it sounds, what we're about to read is one of those things that encourages me in spirit and in truth to spiritually come prepared to bend the knee, to participate and to worship. And like I said, there's times that all different kinds of things can happen. But you know what I'm saying. It's hard to get things out of services if we're just totally frazzled by the time we get here. And sometimes we are, but we just do the best we can when that happens. So here's number 3. Look at the intensity. They mocked him, they insulted him, the purple robe, the crown, and the falling on the knees. Wow. And just my generation would say they're really in it. They're really involved in what's going on. So here's the purple robe. They twisted together a crown. And the part that just is so hard to even read is that, the idea of the other's going to say they're going to beat him and the crown's going to start the blood flow. Hail, King of the Jews. 2 different cries, 2 different statements are going to come from Roman lips while Jesus is on the cross. One is the mockery of the King of the Jews, and the other is the sincerity that, this one was the Son of God. They struck him on the head with a staff. When you ate as much dust as we did on the farm, we spit a lot in places, but we really tried to work hard not to spit on anybody. That was not accepted. My brother's in a very intense intramural game, and the other team was the 4th letter of the alphabet, and they were ahead. The other team was ahead at 20 points at halftime, and my brother got either 5 or 6 guys together and says, "Guys, we've got them in the palm of our hand. We're 20 points behind." They're overconfident. They're just if we really work hard, we can pull this off. Well, one guy sprained his ankle. They just had 5. So they left him back on defense. So they're playing 4 on 5 on the other end. And the game goes into overtime. So having 4 guys playing offense, they make up the 20 points. The game goes in overtime. My brother is coming to the half-court line, and just when he straddles the half-court line, this guy spits all over his face, hoping that either he'll drop the ball or go back court or something else. because he waited until he got right straddling the half-court line, and he just spit all over his face. And Kent's able to grab the ball and holler, "Timeout, timeout." And he stood there and wanted one of his guys to come and bring the towel from the bench so everybody could see these guys are so low that they're willing to spit on someone in the face to try to win the game. So just everything here is just degrading, humiliating, and those details are given. And then falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. They mocked him. They took off the purple robe, and they put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. I'm sorry. This isn't passive aggressive, but I wouldn't want to be in any of these guys' sandals on the judgment day. I know he's going to say, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." But you just imagine every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, and you were part of this particular group. That means always a haunting thing. So that's the soldiers. And all what you see, look how Mark just kind of unpacks all the details. It's not bad enough, the soldiers. Then here's our middle daughter would call this the peanut gallery. Okay? Some of you won't understand, but if you're a preacher's daughter, you're used to people saying things about your dad or your family or stuff. And Heather says, well, they put their 25 cents in the communion plate on Sunday so they can say whatever they want to say. But her term was in the house. Well, that's the peanut gallery. Well, here's the peanut gallery. Those who passed by, and look at what Mark says, hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, and here's this word, aha, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. The third group are the chief priests and teachers of the law, mocked him among themselves. And how ironic, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this Christ, the Anointed One, King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. And most of the times when I read this, I'm just thinking, he can't save himself and then save us and save others. And this is a part of the mental preparation that I think has been going on, especially from Gethsemane. Sweat drops of blood, the agony, Father, not my will, but your be done type thing. So we have the soldiers, the passerbyers, the chief priests, teachers of the law, and then that insult to injury. Those who were crucified with him heaped insults. Richard, real quick, Romans 6:6. Lee, can you do Galatians 2:20 real quick?
While they're looking that up,
Yes.
don't you consider those crucified with him as plural?
Yes.
Then why does Luke in 39, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him, but the other criminal rebuked him? Don't you fear God? Since you are under the same sentence, we're justly punished.
Yeah.
Why would there be that difference?
Yeah. This may be the earlier part. I wonder if by the time, because they're all on the cross for 6 hours before legs start getting broke, and I wonder at a later time if the other criminal then might have kind of had an aha moment himself and figuring out more of what's going on. And then here's something else I wonder about, and we don't know. Would either one of these guys ever heard any teaching or preaching while Jesus was in his ministry? Did they may not have known anything about him. But as many people has heard at some point or another, and so great question. I wonder if initially both of them are going to be involved in that, and at a point in time, the other one finally came to, what's the word we want? A realization, perception, understanding is a better word. Maybe came to a better understanding. But at least initially, then this account, then that's what's going to take place. So look at this. Those who crucified with him heaped insults on him. I don't like to do Greek words, but you see the parentheses under crucified with? S-T-A-U-R-O-W is the word for crucify. And then you put the prefix with in front of it to make it a compound word. And so I did this in English. There's the word with plus crucify. So crucified with him is going to be one word because you compound them, you stick them together. And so Mark, and I'm going to say maybe even Luke, I don't think Matthew does this, but Mark specifically uses the term, and he does the compound. Can I stick the two together with my finger and see what's going on? Romans 6:6, we're talking about baptism and dying and death.
Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin.
Lee?
I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I have lived by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose.
Do you see how Paul is going to use in his personal life and in the Christian life, and while this is in a sense spiritual, but this is the symbol of baptism, is that we only bury something that's died. A little bit gross. We don't bury things that are living. If we do, they die. But we bury things that are dead typically. And so the idea of I've been crucified with Christ is this imagery of the putting to death of the old man of sin. And the same thing in Galatians 2:20. And, sing the song, I've been crucified. We sing the song and just go right on. Well, in Romans 6:6, Galatians 2:20, exactly the same word that Mark is going to use, literally of the two thieves, then becomes a word for our putting to death the old person in terms of the Christian walk and the Christian life. Everybody okay? So here's the final events. In the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, so we've already done the time on that. He cries out in a loud voice. This is on the back. And here's our terms, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And again, while we're staying primarily in Mark, in Luke it's going to be Father. And so you stop and think, it's a whole different address when you refer to Father, where in Mark and Luke with the suffering and the anguish is going to be God. And there's a sense that he's always both of these. He is the Son of God, but he's also the Son of Man, a term from Daniel and from Ezekiel, the human side. He's calling for Elijah. Filling a sponge with wine vinegar, he offered him to drink. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. And here's something that no one at the time understood, but how symbolic. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. What comes to mind when you read that? Yes. And that which the temple was a very, and obviously to protect people, you have the Holy of Holies and the holy place for the priest. The temple was a place of separation with degrees of holiness. And of all things, the irony is that which separated humanity from God is split in two, and I assume that they would repair that to some degree or another. But 4 decades later, August of 70, then the whole thing's destroyed. But what wonderful symbolism! Here we are approaching the death of Jesus, and that veil, that separation, that curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. The centurion heard his cry and saw how he died, and says, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, Mary is a very common but a very significant word in terms of the Marys, both in the ministry and here. So Mark says Mary and Mary. You can see other details. I didn't have room for them. Salome was there, and many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were there also. And other than John, who we're going to see in the Gospel of John, We don't have any record of any of the other 11 apostles being there other than John. And can I use the word kind of like a huddle? You got all this stuff going on, all this noise and soldiers. It's probably like this little group of women is over here. But remember, a sword will pierce your heart, she had been told. And we just can't imagine how a mom would feel watching her son being crucified. A quick reference from Luke. In Galilee, these women had followed him. And Luke 8, 2 and 3, they cared for his needs. So when you read Luke 8, 2 and 3, can I rub my fingers together? Some ladies who had some financial positions. And I don't know how else the ministry supported, but you stop and think, how do 12 guys eat for 3.5 years? The primary benefactors of the physical part of the ministry of Jesus is borne by women. Joseph, a prominent member of the council who was waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. The centurion says he's dead, and stop and think, we're at 3 o'clock when he's dead. We've got to go to Pilate, ask permission. The centurion has to go and check, make sure he's dead. The centurion has to come back. The sun's continuing to go down. And as was read for us on Sunday, they made his grave with the rich. The tomb had already been prepared for Joseph, and having that close by, then he's going to place the body in the tomb that had already been prepared. And he gave the body to Joseph. They wrapped it in linen. Well, they took the body down, wrapped it, placed it in a tomb cut out of rock, and then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. And 2 of the Marys saw where he was laid. Now, we mentioned this last week, but I just kind of shudder when I think of this. Joseph and Nicodemus are unclean and probably were not able to take of the Passover. How did they become unclean? Touch a dead body. That's why we talked about last week, they whitewashed the tombs those few days before the major feast, because if you've come from, well, look in Acts 2, every night you come to all these places and you come to Jerusalem and you touch a dead body, dead tomb, you're going to be really frustrated to have traveled that far and be unclean. And so these guys physically are willing to become unclean, to take the Lord's body down, to, and see, it's a ticking clock, because in my mind the sun's headed right over here, headed toward going down, and they're going to need to get home and everything else. There were some provisions in the Old Testament that if you were unclean or on a journey, you could take, but they're going to miss out on the traditional Passover because they are going to become willing to become physically unclean to care for the Lord's body, to take him down, and to do the best they can for the time that they have. Ironic, and we're not going much into the resurrection, but anticipate, women are the earliest witnesses to the resurrection. Okay. Rhonda, don't stone me. Ladies, don't get your knickers in a knot. But in the first century, one of the last witnesses that you'd want in a trial is a woman. That's hard for me to say, but that's how their culture was. Isn't it ironic that the first witnesses to the resurrection and the first ones to spread the good news to the apostles that he's raised from the dead are women? My brother-in-law, Tom, has said a lot of times, if you're allergic to women, you're not going to get along well in heaven because heaven's just going to be full of them. They're the ones who care for the physical needs. They're the ones who look after him. He goes to the home of Mary and Martha. The women are the ones who are at the cross. The women's are the one who go with him to see where he's laid in the tomb. And the women are going to be the first ones to be the witnesses to the resurrection. And you think, oh, well done, girls. So we'll wrap up with these things. We'll read through these and be done. This is a quotation. The Gospels, and the word passion narrative is like the cross, the crucifixion. The Gospel are stories of the cross with an extended introduction. They all start at a different place, but they all end up at the same place. So here's our word Abba, and small children would call their father, like our closest word is daddy, probably. Again, our Heather is very Elizabethan. It's always father. But Abba is this very, very special word, intimate word for close relationship with the Father. And you'll see Abba used with what happens to us through the Spirit. We are able to cry out, Abba, Father, which is such a significant term. And there we are. You see the hyphen, Bar Abbas, the Son of the Father. And again, we'll come back and touch on that, but what an irony. Aha, a word for the intensity of the mockery and pretended worship of the King of Israel. And I've said this, but look at it. Would it be tragic if those who, quote, worship Jesus in mockery were more devoted to their worship than believers who supposedly worship in spirit and truth? And I just think about this a lot. Can I just say something? And this doesn't relate to any of you directly. You would just be amazed at what all goes on in the audience in church on Sunday during one lesson. If you can just kind of see from coast to coast, it's just absolutely amazing the thing Charles has seen while he's doing sermons. We're having a Sunday night. We have about 6'4" guy who's the Eastern Oklahoma County Sheriff. And he comes in, and this guy in the back row, I can kind of tell he's a visitor, he's kind of excited. The back door opens, and this big hand just gets him by the shoulder, lifts him out of the pew, and they walk outside. Okay, where are we? What on earth is going on? Herman was the Eastern Oklahoma County Sheriff. Well, the guy had come in, and he said, I could smell a spirit on him when he came in. So if you're a sheriff, you don't just check that at the door when you come in the building. So he said, I could smell a spirit on him when he came in, and he told me he was Pentecostal. And I kept watching him, and he is about to be filled with the Spirit, and I felt like it would be better for him and I to go out in the foyer and have a chat than for him to start speaking in tongues on the back row. Okay, where are we? Let's see what's going on. And I understand that. That's just a part of life. But isn't it wonderful that we're not like Jesus and we have any idea what's going on in people's minds while we're giving a lesson? And I think about this a lot. On Sunday, I want to be sure that I worship the Father with as much thought and foresight and intention as I can, as these guys did in mockery. And I use the term spirit and truth for us. We mentioned this in 4. Mark opens and nearly closes with statements, Son of God. And there's going to be 19 miracles, but he's also the Son of Man. And he's rejected in Nazareth because they knew him as, and here's the Son of Man, the carpenter, the son of Mary. And if you weren't in class, and I did this earlier, this was in the auditorium, we have a record of 6 siblings in Mark chapter 6. So do James, Joseph, Judas, and Simeon. So we know of 4 brothers. And then he says what? Sisters. We don't know how many more there were, but a minimum of 2. And so we have a record of at least a minimum of 6, can I say half brothers and sisters? Everybody follow what I'm saying? And so Mark 6 gives us the record of at least 6 of the siblings that Jesus has. So he can't be from God or the Messiah. He's human. we know all of his relatives and a part of the rejection that went on. So Jesus sighed deeply when the Pharisees asked for a sign. And look at this: indignation, anger, and grief in 3:5. He told people, you don't know the time of the appearing, 13:32. Being rejected by the religious leaders. Words in Gethsemane, a feeling of horror and impending foreboding from there's no escape. My soul is overwhelmed with the cry of death. And so in Mark, and this to kind of wrap this part up, when I think of the cross in Mark, then I hear the cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in Mark, I think primarily of the suffering, the anguish, the death, the ransom that's paid. And here's number 6. We don't understand what Mark is doing unless we see he's basically writing about the cross. He is a theologian of the cross. The center of gravity is his teaching, his theology about the cross. Mark will root it in history. He says a great deal about what Jesus did. The gospel moves along at a very lively pace. And even though his account is shorter, there is a vividness about his narrative and his accounts that are fuller and more full of life than Matthew or Mark. And as we said, because Matthew and Mark have these teaching sections and these parables, when you have all three of them, Mark will give more details of activities. Matthew and Luke will abbreviate that because they have more of the parables and the teachings that will fill their gospel out. So Mark takes the accounts of the life, unites them with the events of the cross, and he shows the earthly life of Jesus is important and is an integral part of the process whereby God intervened in human life to bring salvation to sinners. And then 2 more and we're done. Give his life a ransom for many. That one just, and Matthew's going to mention that, but it's just such a centerpiece in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is saying that he will pay the price to set people free. So think about that. He is going to pay the price to set people free. Ransom is used of freeing a prisoner of war or a slave or someone under the sentence of death. The ransom is paid on behalf of many. And the word in the text is ante, which has used a substitute in the place of. So Mark sees the death of Jesus as everybody okay with vicarious? Someone give me a quick definition of vicarious. Doing something selflessly for someone else. Like sometimes a soldier is vicariously giving his life to save the other guys. Moms have given their life to save a child or something. So it was vicarious and voluntary, the giving of life as a payment for mankind's sins. So 3 verses on the cross for us today. And we mentioned this very early. 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And I think about that a lot. What exactly does that mean? God made him to be sin who had no sin, to be sin for us, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. 2 verses with ransom. 1 Peter 1:18-19. You were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your fathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. And Revelation 5:9 is my favorite verse in the book of Revelation. And with COVID being over, having some of our missionaries back on Sunday night, you think about this, because Sheila was asking Mel Sr., I think he said there's like 26 capitals in Brazil, but 6 of them don't have a church yet, and so they're trying to, and you're up in the upper part of the Amazon basin. All those places are not next to the coast. That's why there's no church. It's such a far distance. And you stop and think, they sang a new song, worthy art thou to take the scroll and open its seals, for thou wast slain, and by thy blood thou didst ransom men for God, And then here it comes. Every tribe, every tongue, every people, and every nation. I have no idea. God's going to take care of this in his own way. But what language are we going to speak in heaven?
Portuguese.
Do we have a vote for who got the most people from their group? I don't know. That's kind of a childish thing to ask, but just let that sink in as we leave. There will be people from every tribe, every tongue, every people, and every nation. And because we have been ransomed by the blood of Jesus, then we will spend an eternity forever with God as those who were ransomed by the blood.
It'll be like Pentecost, everybody hears in their own tongue.
Precisely. Well, and Bob Gregg's, you may remember Bob Gregg's senior, what was Mr. Gregg Sr., who was, he did a radio program, and he just mentioned something. He said, I wonder if the miracle on Pentecost was a gift of the ear rather than the tongue. They heard everyone in their own language, and obviously the Spirit was able to do that. But he said sometimes we think they were all speaking different languages, but he said it's very specifically maybe as much a gift of the ear as it was the tongue that they could hear. But not often, but occasionally I've been in a service where I don't know the language, but 2 or 3 times we at least sang a song that I knew in English, and so you could, in your mind, you could follow along. And dear friends who went to Buenos Aires, as they're learning Spanish, they taught from the Gospel of Mark. And Steve said, Mark 16, 15, and 16 says the same thing in Spanish that it does in English. So by putting a Spanish Bible in front of someone, then as you're learning the language, you could cheat a little bit and pull off of your English understanding while you're learning the language. But he said we read out of a Spanish New Testament, but that's what he said. He said that helped us to learn the language, but very early we could put that and start teaching people because it said the same thing in their language that it did in English.
One of the reasons you probably think that, besides somebody mentioning that, because there's a problem with how many apostles there were and how many languages there were.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Yeah. But you think about that. We started on the first day, and what was Pentecost originally? It was the harvest, and before Passover. And Brad, when I first read this, it just grew up on the farm, it just rang a bell. They finished the barley harvest, and then they came to Jerusalem for the Passover, but the wheat ripens later. And how many days later? 50. So while they were gone, the wheat would ripen. They would go back home and do the wheat harvest, and then come back for Pentecost and bring sheaves of wheat as a part of the gathering. And then, close to very much where we are now, the fall crops are coming in. And so each of the 3 major feasts where they were to come to Jerusalem were preceded by major harvest festivals. And so what is Pentecost is the feast of harvest, and they've been harvesting wheat for 1,500 years. And it's the first harvest of humanity under the new covenant is done on the day of Pentecost, which then is a spiritual parallel of something they've been doing physically for 1,500 years. God bless. What a treat to have you guys here. Have a great evening.